Hello, I'm Michael, and if you're here, it's because you're as attracted to fear as I am. The night in New York had a peculiar rhythm. The main streets were bathed in artificial lights, while the alleys and outlying neighborhoods disappeared into deep shadows. Liam Carter, an Uber driver, followed his nightly routine, driving through the city's busy streets with the aim of reaching his daily goal. In the app, a new race appeared. The request came from a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn. He accepted immediately and continued to the boarding location. On the sidewalk, a woman waited, hugging a stack of papers. The run seemed ordinary, and Liam started the route, guided by GPS instructions. As the minutes passed, something on the route began to change. The familiar streets gave way to deserted thoroughfares, lined with old, abandoned houses. The streetlights, spaced and dimmed, illuminated just enough to show the decay around them. Liam kept his hands steady on the steering wheel, but he felt the weight of growing tension. The GPS, which until then was working perfectly, began to recalculate the route erratically, taking them along even more isolated paths. The screen flickered, presenting instructions that seemed contradictory. Without warning, the app crashed, leaving only a white screen that reflected light into the car's interior. For a few seconds, silence reigned. Then, a message appeared on the screen, written in red letters. "Don't trust the passenger." Liam felt a chill run up his spine. He blinked, trying to process what he was seeing. Looking in the rearview mirror, he noticed that the passenger was quiet, focused on her cell phone. The warning seemed aimed at him alone. Ignoring the unsettling sensation, he reset the GPS and continued driving. But the feeling that something was out of place intensified with every kilometer. The streets became narrower, the streetlights disappeared, and now only headlights lit the way. The surrounding environment seemed to become more oppressive. Abandoned houses were multiplying, and Liam noticed that some windows were partially open, as if invisible eyes were watching them. The absolute silence outside the car was disturbing, interrupted only by the sound of tires on the asphalt. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed from the trunk. It was a dry, muffled noise, as if something was stuck and struggling. Liam locked his hands on the steering wheel as the car rocked slightly. The sound persisted, rhythmic, as if something was trying to escape. Without slowing down, he kept his eyes fixed on the road, but couldn't help but glance briefly in the rearview mirror. The passenger remained motionless in the back seat, but there was something wrong with her expression. The dim light illuminated his face, revealing an unearthly pallor. His eyes, which had previously looked tired, now looked empty, almost as if there was no life in them. The atmosphere inside the car became unbearable. The message on the GPS appeared again, this time occupying the entire screen. "Get out now. She is not what she seems." Liam didn't know whether to stop the car or speed up. The survival instinct made him continue driving, but doubt grew like a poison in his mind. As the trunk continued to make unsettling sounds, he realized that the streets ahead formed a circle. The GPS now showed an endless route, as if stuck in a loop. The mileage marker remained static, despite the car being in motion. The last thing Liam saw before the car's lights went out was a figure on the road, motionless, as if waiting for them. When the headlights went out, darkness took over the car, swallowing everything around it. For a few moments, the only audible sound was that of the engine still running, but even that seemed muffled, as if the car were trapped in a silent bubble. Liam tried to turn the lights back on, but the dashboard flickered and remained inert, as if something had drained all of the vehicle's power. The sound in the trunk stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that seemed more terrifying than the noise. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as sweat dripped down his forehead. The air inside the car seemed heavier, denser, making it difficult to breathe. The road before him, which had previously been uneven, now appeared completely smooth, a perfect, shiny asphalt that reflected the non-existent light. In the rearview mirror, the image of the passenger remained unchanged. She was still like a statue, but her presence seemed to grow, filling the car in a way that was impossible to ignore. Liam tried to open the driver's door, but the handle wouldn't budge. The car was locked, all the locks firmly secured, as if they had been activated by an invisible force. He tried to turn on his phone, but the screen glowed for just a second before turning off, showing a reflection that looked wrong. The reflected image was not that of his face, but of something pale and deformed, as if a shadow had taken the place of his figure. The GPS, which had previously been off, turned on again, but now showed an impossible route, a straight line that never ended, with the destination marker flashing frantically at the top of the screen. The previous message was gone, replaced by a new one. "Don't look back." Liam felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His breathing became ragged, his heart beating so hard that it seemed to echo in the silence. He wanted to ignore the warning, but the urge to look was almost irresistible. A chill crept up his spine, as if something was slowly approaching him from inside the car. Without realizing it, he started to accelerate, even without seeing the path. The speedometer rose, but the sensation of movement was nil. It was as if he was trapped in an endless space, running towards nothingness. The sound of the engine increased, but the surrounding environment remained static, unchanged, like a painting that never changed. Suddenly, the trunk gave way. The lid opened with a bang, and the rearview mirror revealed something Liam would never forget. A figure, indistinct and shrouded in shadow, slowly emerged from the rear compartment. It wasn't human. The contours of the body were irregular, as if they had been sculpted by inexperienced hands, and the eyes, two dark cavities, seemed to suck in all the light around them. The cold in the car became unbearable, as if the heat had been completely drained from the environment. Liam felt his body freeze, his muscles unable to respond. Everything inside him told him to run away, but he was paralyzed, trapped by a force that seemed beyond his understanding. The figure slowly advanced through the car, passing the back seat where the passenger was sitting. She, however, did not seem to notice the creature's presence. He remained motionless, his gaze fixed on something Liam couldn't see. As the creature approached, something impossible happened. The passenger's face began to change, like a mask being removed. His skin seemed to melt away, revealing something similar to what was emerging from the trunk. The same uneven texture, the same lifeless eyes. It was as if the two figures were one, connected by something invisible and terrible. Just when Liam thought he couldn't take it anymore, a deafening sound echoed through the car, a mix of screaming and ripping metal. He closed his eyes instinctively, expecting the worst. When he opened his eyes again, everything had changed. He was alone, standing in the middle of a deserted road. The car was intact, with no signs of damage. The GPS showed the original route, as if nothing had happened. But Liam knew this wasn't a dream. The cold in his bones, the sweat on his skin, and the deafening sound still echoed in his mind. The only evidence of what had happened was the trunk. When he got out of the car to check, he found claw marks deeply etched into the bodywork, as if something had been desperately trying to escape. The car was stopped in the middle of a deserted road. The only sound was the wind, whistling gently through the gnarled trees that lined the road. Liam was outside the vehicle, standing in front of the trunk. The claw marks on the bodywork were deep, intersecting in irregular patterns, as if the thing inside had fought with primal desperation to escape. With shaking hands, he turned the key to open the compartment. The lid slowly lifted, revealing absolute emptiness. There was nothing inside except the spare tire and some tools, neatly organized. But the smell persisted, a mixture of rust, wet earth, and something sour that made his stomach turn. Liam looked around. The road seemed endless, disappearing into the horizon without any sign of civilization. The sky above was overcast, the stars completely hidden by a dense layer of clouds. He knew he needed to get out of there, but every part of his body was begging him to stay still. Back in the car, the atmosphere seemed to have changed. The air was heavy, as if something invisible was present, filling the empty space. The rear-view mirror, which previously only reflected the interior of the vehicle, now showed something that shouldn't be there, a different road. It wasn't the same one he was in. It was a road covered in fog, lined with rusty lampposts from which hung blinking lamps. He looked at the real road through the windshield, just to confirm that he wasn't imagining things. It was the same as before, straight and deserted. But in the rear-view mirror, the other road was still there, like a reflection of a place that shouldn't exist. When Liam placed his hand on the gear lever, the sound returned. The same muffled, rhythmic noise, as if something was trying to get your attention. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the trunk. It was coming from the back seat. He didn't have the courage to look. Sweat dripped from his forehead, and the steering wheel beneath his hands felt colder than metal should be. The sound grew, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. Finally, the impulse was stronger than the fear. He glanced at the rear-view mirror. In the back seat, where the passenger should have been, there was now something he could barely define. It was a human form, but distorted, like an image reflected in broken glass. The outlines were erratic, blurred, and the eyes glowed with an unnatural hue, as if they were burning from the inside out. Suddenly the creature moved, not fluidly, but with abrupt movements, as if she were being pulled by invisible threads. The form leaned forward slowly until the empty eyes were almost touching the rear-view mirror. Liam reacted instinctively. He started the car, speeding down the road. The engine roared, but the speedometer wouldn't go up. The sensation of movement was illusory. He was running in place. The surrounding scenery began to change. The trees on the sides of the road were blurred, and the sky above took on a reddish hue, as if it were on fire. In the back seat, the figure dissolved into mist, disappearing in an instant, but the air around them felt heavier, almost crushing. The GPS blinked again, now showing a single destination: the end. That's when Liam saw it. On the road ahead, the same figure that had emerged from the trunk was now standing right in the middle of the road. This time, it had a defined shape. She was tall, thin, with disproportionately long arms and fingers that seemed to extend beyond what was natural. The face was not human. It was a grotesque mask of stretched flesh, no eyes or mouth, just a smooth, unsettling surface. He didn't slow down. Instinct told him to pass straight through, as if he could escape by running over it. But when the car should have collided, it passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. The engine died immediately, and the car stopped in the middle of the road. Silence returned, but this time, Liam felt something different. It wasn't the empty silence it had been before. It was charged, as if the air itself was whispering something incomprehensible. He looked around and realized he was no longer in the same place. The road was gone. Now, he was in an open field, surrounded by a dense fog that prevented any vision beyond a few meters. On the ground, tire tracks disappeared into the mist, indicating that he had been taken somewhere beyond understanding. In front of the car, a figure slowly emerged from the fog. She was the passenger, or at least something that wore her face. The silence was overwhelming. Liam watched, transfixed, as the figure of the passenger emerged from the fog. His face seemed normal at first glance, but there was something deeply wrong. His smile was a little too wide, his eyes seemed fixed on something that wasn't there, and his body seemed to float slightly above the ground. He took a deep breath, trying to regain control. The car seemed to be the only anchor connecting him to what was left of reality. With difficulty, he opened the door, stepping out into the misty field. The air was freezing, cutting his skin like razors, but he knew he couldn't stay in the car. That would drive him crazy. The passenger remained motionless, but her presence was overwhelming. The surrounding fog seemed to slowly swirl around him, as if it was attracted by it. Liam took a tentative step, and the figure turned toward him, quick and fluid, as if already waiting for him to act. So he listened. Not a voice, but a sound. Something between a whine and a whisper that seemed to originate directly in his mind. It was as if she were talking, but without making a sound. The words were unclear, but the message was unmistakable. You shouldn't have accepted. The panic began to give way to something more powerful: anger. He felt a wave of adrenaline course through his body, dispelling the cold that was paralyzing him. Since the beginning of that night, he had been thrown from one inexplicable event to another, manipulated by forces he didn't understand. But now, something inside him refused to budge. Liam screamed into the void, a primal scream, an attempt to assert his own existence in this meaningless nightmare. The sound reverberated across the field, echoing back as if space itself was mocking him. He didn't know why, but he started walking towards the passenger. Every step was an act of defiance against the terror that consumed him. When he was just a few feet away from her, the figure tilted its head, as if curious about her sudden courage. The smile widened, and the air around him became thicker, heavier. Liam felt something in his pocket, a vibration. He picked up his cell phone, expecting it to be broken like before, but the screen now showed something different: a map. He was at the center of a vast network of roads that formed a circle. In the corner of the screen, a red dot flashed incessantly with a word written below: choice. He didn't understand what it meant, but he knew this was the next step. While holding the cell phone, the figure took a step forward. The fog around her lifted for a moment, revealing something Liam would never forget: handprints etched into her skin, like scars left by an ancient fire. The word choice started flashing faster on the screen, and Liam understood. He had to decide whether to face the creature or whether to give in to fear, surrendering to that nightmare without a fight. Liam looked around, searching for something, anything, that could help him. On the ground, a small piece of metal glowed faintly. It was a key, apparently ordinary, but it seemed to pulse with a strange energy. Without thinking, he picked it up. The moment his fingers touched the key, the mist around him receded, creating a clear circle around him. The figure began to move erratically, as if it was trying to enter the protected space. The whisper returned, louder, more insistent: "There is no way out." But Liam didn't believe it. Holding the key tightly, he ran in the opposite direction, away from the creature and the road that had brought him here. His feet hit the heavy, wet ground, and the mist seemed to resist, pulling him back with each step. Then he saw it. A solitary door, made of dark wood, rising in the middle of the field. She seemed out of place, unconnected to anything, but there was something about her that attracted him. It was as if the key in his hand was connected to that portal. Without hesitation, Liam ran to the door and fitted the key into the lock. When he turned it, a low, deep sound echoed, and the door opened, revealing a corridor lit by golden light. Behind him, the figure began to scream, a terrible sound that seemed like the wail of 1,000 voices. He walked through the door and slammed it shut, leaving the scream behind. The hallway was quiet, warm, and the sound of his footsteps was muffled by the soft carpet. In the background, a second door awaited him, marked with a symbol he didn't recognize. The golden corridor was an illusory respite. Liam felt the pleasant warmth around him, but his mind remained alert, as if the door behind him could be opened at any moment by what he left behind. The second door in the background pulsed lightly, as if it was waiting for him. He approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the absolute silence. The symbol on the door was disconcerting, a complex spiral made up of jagged lines that seemed to change as he looked at it. The key in his hand grew warm, pulsing like a living heart. Liam took a deep breath and opened the door. Contrary to what I expected, there was no hallway or room. He was swallowed by total darkness, but this time he felt no immediate fear. It was an eerie, almost comforting darkness, until voices began to echo around him. They were family. "You should have chosen another path. Why did you continue? Why didn't you stop? None of this is real, is it?" The voices were those of people he knew, friends, family, even the passenger herself. The words, however, were full of accusations, questions, and irony, as if mocking his persistence. He tried to ignore them, but they filled every corner of his mind, invading his thoughts. Then the darkness was torn apart by a flash. Liam found himself back in his car, parked in front of an old abandoned gas station. The road was deserted, but the GPS showed something strange, a complete circular line as if he had returned exactly to the point where he started. The smell of rust returned, now stronger, almost unbearable. He felt something move in the back seat, but this time he didn't look. The key in his hand shined brightly, and the heat radiating from it guided him to a clear thought: destroy the circle. He looked at the GPS once again, trying to figure out what to do. The word choice flashed again, but now with two options: face or give in. He knew none would be easy. Liam got out of the car and looked around. The gas station seemed to be the only fixed point in that distorted reality. With determined steps, he went to the building, where he found an old fuel tank and a box of matches forgotten on the dusty counter. He knew what he needed to do. Without hesitation, he returned to the car and poured fuel around it, creating a circle of fire ready to be lit. The moment he struck the match, the voices returned, now in a desperate tone. "Don't do that. You don't understand what you're destroying. It will be the end of you too." He hesitated for a brief second, but the memory of terror drove him forward. He dropped the match, and the circle of fire lit up. The flames grew rapidly, consuming the surrounding space. The GPS in the car exploded into sparks, and the passenger's figure appeared again, now outside the car, standing in the middle of the circle of fire. She was no longer human. The smile was gone, and his form was constantly changing, as if he were made of mist and flesh at the same time. But the fire seemed to affect her. She screamed, a sound that shook the ground, and she began to fall apart, piece by piece, until there was only a void where she had been. When it was all over, Liam found himself back on the road, the sky clear above him. The car was intact, and the GPS finally showed the way home. But he knew something had changed. The emptiness inside him was a constant reminder that even though he had escaped, he would never be the same. He got into the car and drove, without looking back. The road ahead seemed endless, but this time, Liam felt like he was actually moving. The trees, once static and oppressive, quickly passed by the car windows, and the sky above took on a shade of blue that he hadn't seen in hours, or maybe days, he no longer knew. The GPS marked a familiar destination, his home in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago. Despite being on the right path, the feeling of relief didn't come. He drove in silence, trying to absorb what he had just experienced. The hands shook slightly on the steering wheel, and the smell of rust and smoke still seemed to permeate the car. But there was something more. The rear-view mirror, which had terrified him so much, now reflected only the empty interior of the vehicle. He constantly checked, as if waiting for something to come up again, but everything remained normal. Even so, an uneasiness grew in his chest, as if the end of that journey was just an interval and not a conclusion. When he finally entered his neighborhood, the familiar brought momentary comfort. The house lights, the impeccable sidewalks, and even the distant sound of a dog barking created an almost surreal contrast with the deserted road he had left behind. As he parked in front of his house, the GPS abruptly turned off, the screen going completely black. Liam looked at the device for a moment, feeling as if it was a farewell to something that had accompanied him that night. He turned off the car and sat in silence, trying to find the courage to leave. As he opened the door, a breath of fresh air enveloped him, dispelling the weight that seemed to oppress his mind. He walked to the front door, feeling exhausted, as if he had run a marathon. Each step seemed more difficult than the last, and when he finally turned the key in the lock, the world around him seemed to sigh along with him. The house was exactly as he had left it. Everything was in place, from the sofa with the folded blanket to the lamp lit in the corner of the room. It was a scenario that should have brought comfort, but something felt wrong. There was absolute silence, the kind of silence that was unnatural. Liam went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and got a glass of water. When he turned to the counter, he saw something that made him drop the glass on the floor. A single key, identical to the one he had used to open the door in the misty field. It was there, Resting on the polished wood as if waiting for him, he backed away, his heart racing, and stumbled to the ground. He looked around, but there was nothing unusual, just the key, shining in the kitchen light. For a moment, he thought about taking it. Maybe there was something he hadn't finished, an answer he still needed to seek. But something inside him stopped him. He took a cloth, wrapped it around the key, and put it in a drawer, locking it with a lock he rarely used. Without the strength to think anymore, he went to the bedroom, threw himself on the bed, and closed his eyes. That night, Liam didn't dream, but when he woke up, he found something engraved on the wall next to the bed, a spiral identical to the one on the door he had walked through. He knew it wasn't over. Months have passed since the night Liam could never forget. He had done his best to get back to his routine. He continued working as an app driver, although he avoided certain neighborhoods and nighttime hours. By day, the world seemed safer, more stable. But he knew that what had happened on that road was not an illusion, nor something that could simply be buried in the past. He didn't tell anyone what he had experienced. He once tried to share the experience with a close friend, but the words sounded absurd even to him. How to explain something that defied logic and sanity? Liam learned to keep the secret to himself, carrying it like an invisible scar. The key, locked in the kitchen drawer, became a constant presence in his mind. He avoided her at all costs, but on some sleepless nights, he was unable to resist the temptation. He opened the drawer, looked at the cloth that covered it, and felt a mix of repulsion and attraction. It seemed to pulse, almost calling to him, but Liam never touched it again. The spiral on his bedroom wall, however, was gone the next day. It was as if it had never existed, but Liam knew that was part of the game. The entity, or whatever it was, seemed to play with him, appearing in moments of carelessness, the reflection of something in the rearview mirror, a faint smell of rust on the street, an indistinct sound in the silence of the early morning. Then one day, while driving during a cloudy morning, the car's GPS blinked. He wasn't using the app, but the screen turned on by itself. A new route appeared, charting a path he had never seen before. It was a winding line that ended in a red dot with the same word as before, choice. Liam stopped the car on the side of the road, immediately turning off the GPS. His breathing was heavy, and he felt cold sweat running down his forehead. But even with the device turned off, he knew where the path would take him. It was a summons. For weeks, Liam tried to ignore the incident, but the more he tried to move on, the more things around him changed. Small objects disappeared and reappeared in unlikely places. The lights in the house flickered for no reason, and, most unsettling of all, he began to dream again. Dreams that always ended with the vision of a dark door, identical to the one he had opened in the misty field. On the 1-year anniversary of that night, Liam finally made a decision. He entered the kitchen, opened the locked drawer, and took out the key. It felt warm, as if it had a life of its own, and the metal seemed to pulse against his palm. Without saying a word, he left the house and got into the car. The GPS turned on itself, displaying the route he already knew by heart. The road ahead was empty, covered in a light fog that seemed to dance in the dawn lights. Liam drove in silence, knowing the final choice was before him. Before we continue, if you like my content, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments at what time do you dare to listen to these macabre stories. Now, without further interruptions, let's move on to the next story. Rodrigo, an experienced app driver, used to navigate the busy streets of Rio de Janeiro with ease. During the day, he adapted to the city's traffic chaos, but at night, the city took on another dimension. With the emptier streets and the sultry climate in the region, Rio became a silent and unsettling place, especially on rainy nights like that one. It was a Friday night, and Rodrigo's watch showed 11:30 p.m. He was in Botafogo near the beach, waiting for a new race. The steady, fine rain reflected the lights from the streetlights in the street puddles, creating a ghostly landscape. The cell phone vibrated, signaling a request. When he looked, he noticed that the boarding point was at Lagoa Rodrigo de Freitas, a nearby area, but the destination was curious. Rua do Alecrim, Jardim Botanico neighborhood, number unknown. Rodrigo hesitated for a moment. Rua do Alecrim was in an area further away from the city, a part of the botanical garden that was dimly lit and more deserted at night. Although I knew it wasn't the best time to go there, the price of the race was too attractive to ignore. With a sigh, he accepted the race. When he arrived at the boarding point, he saw a woman with her back turned, leaning against the wall under a black umbrella. She wore a long, heavy dress for the hot, humid night. As Rodrigo approached, she slowly turned around, her eyes fixed on the car. Without saying a word, he got into the back seat of the vehicle with disconcerting calm. Rodrigo tried not to think too much about the strange behavior and began the journey, focusing on the road and the rain that didn't stop. The silence in the car was thick and oppressive. The woman, motionless, did not look out of the window, did not use her cell phone, and did not show any sign of life except for slow and steady breathing. With each kilometer covered, Rodrigo felt a growing sense of discomfort, as if something was wrong, but he didn't know what it was. As he drove, Rodrigo noticed that the GPS was starting to fail. With each change of direction, the system recalculated the route, and he noticed that the route was distorted. The streets did not correspond to what was on the map, and at times, the GPS simply disappeared from the screen, leaving him stranded. He looked in the rearview mirror, but the image of the woman didn't change. She was there, standing still, her eyes fixed, and something in her gaze seemed empty and distant. The feeling that something was wrong grew. The surrounding environment began to transform. The streets of Rio, once known, now seemed different. The sound of the windshield wipers was the only sound that cut through the unusual silence. As Rodrigo drove, the neighborhoods he was used to passing through became increasingly distant and unfamiliar. The feeling of being lost, despite following the GPS route, intensified. The streets became narrower, poorly lit, and Rio, with its vibrant and happy landscapes, now became a dark and strange city, unrecognizable. The woman in the back seat remained motionless, her gaze fixed somewhere ahead, as if she were not there, but somewhere far away. When Rodrigo looked at the rearview mirror, he saw something that made him stop the car abruptly. Her face was not the same. There was something distorted and dark, as if the shadows of the city were blending with her figure, making her more and more indistinct. Fear took him completely, but when he tried to control his breathing and look for some logical explanation, the GPS continued to fail, guiding him to places he had never seen. The feeling of being in a nightmare intensified, but Rodrigo didn't know what to do. The car, which had previously passed with ease through the busy streets, was now immersed in a darkness that seemed to swallow every step. And it was at that moment, in a gap of tension and confusion, that he felt an abrupt change in direction. Something was wrong. The car was no longer on the streets of the Rio he knew, but somewhere very far away, in a city that didn't exist. Rodrigo tried to remain calm, but his mind was in total disarray. The car seemed to be in some kind of trance, as if he no longer controlled the steering. The streets he was driving on, now crooked and dimly lit, seemed to disappear into shadow, and the sound of the rain, which had previously been constant, seemed to be absorbed by the darkness. The feeling of claustrophobia grew by the second, and the woman behind him, although unchanging, seemed to have taken on an even more oppressive presence. With his hands shaking on the steering wheel, Rodrigo avoided a hole in the road, but when he looked at the rearview mirror again, the woman's reflection seemed more distant, as if she were becoming more and more dim, as if she were a ghost. He blinked his eyes, trying to focus on the road ahead. The GPS, still failing, continued to recalculate the route. He had stopped listening to any kind of instructions, and now, instead of the route, the map only showed a straight line, which took him to an unnamed point, marked by a single word, choose. Rodrigo knew something was wrong. He quickly looked around, but the neighborhood he was in seemed increasingly desolate. There were no more people on the sidewalks, nor other cars on the street. The silence stretched out, heavy and dense, as the road narrowed, as if swallowing him. The woman behind him remained silent, but something in her gaze was different now. She was no longer static as before. Rodrigo noticed that his eyes seemed to shine with an unusual intensity, as if they were reflecting the few streetlights, distorted and sinister. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, trying to analyze the figure behind him, but what he saw was no longer human. She seemed to have distorted, transformed into an entity without a defined shape, as if she were made of shadows, with vague and diffuse contours. The pressure in Rodrigo's chest increased. He felt as if he was being watched by something more than just a person, something that was leading him down a path of no return. With every turn made in the dark streets of Rio, he felt as if he were falling into an abyss, without knowing where it would take him. There was no longer any way to trust the GPS, and he began to notice that the once familiar streets now seemed to be turning into an endless maze. Fear dominated him, and the idea of returning home seemed as distant as the horizon. He was trapped in a nightmare, but he still couldn't understand what the purpose of this journey was. The tension in the air was palpable, and Rodrigo felt a growing discomfort. The traffic lights, which used to mark the rhythm of the city, were now off, and the road seemed endless, with no exit sign. He wondered how much longer he could keep driving. That's when the car, apparently alone, made a sudden turn and entered an even narrower street without any traffic signs. The walls of the buildings were getting closer and closer, almost touching, as if the space was too tight for the car to pass through. Rodrigo tried to accelerate, but the car's engine seemed to fight against him, becoming weaker and weaker, as if it were losing power. The rain continued to hit with more intensity, but the water no longer formed puddles on the street. It seemed to evaporate before touching the asphalt. With every meter, Rodrigo felt like he was being swallowed by the city, lost in a web of streets that didn't exist on the map. When he finally looked in the rearview mirror again, he saw something that froze his blood. The woman was closer, much closer. Her eyes, now completely black, were fixed on him, and a feeling of cold despair took over the car. He tried to speed up, but the car was stuck, stopped in the middle of the street. The sound of rain seemed to disappear completely. The silence was absolute, except for the growing sound of something distant, something Rodrigo couldn't identify. It was a muffled sound, as if there was an invisible presence surrounding the car. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to stay calm, but his muscles were tense, his breathing labored. Then, without warning, the sound stopped. The road in front of him, which had previously seemed narrow and suffocating, abruptly opened up into a large, empty space. Rodrigo looked ahead, and what he saw made him tremble. In front of him, in the center of a large, shadowy field, was a large iron door, old and rusty. The woman, who until then had been silent, was now standing behind him, watching. His eyes, now completely empty, shone with a cold intensity. Without fully understanding what was happening, but feeling an inexplicable need to move forward, Rodrigo put the car in gear and began driving towards the door. The sound of the engine slowly faded away until he realized he was no longer in control of the car. The steering wheel was frozen in his hands, and he could no longer move his feet. The car approached the door, and the sound that had previously been distant now seemed to be right next to it, as if something was approaching. Rodrigo closed his eyes, feeling the growing presence of something supernatural and incomprehensible. When he opened his eyes again, the car was stopped, and the shadowy field had disappeared, replaced by a familiar street, with the traffic lights back on and the traffic flowing normally. But the woman was no longer in the back seat. The road in front of him looked normal, as if nothing had happened. However, when Rodrigo looked in the rearview mirror, the reflection was no longer his own. It was a deep and absolute void, faceless, formless. He looked ahead, but he already knew that whatever happened that night would stay with him forever. Rodrigo felt his throat tighten, his breathing labored, as he tried to process what had just happened. He had woken up to a scene that seemed normal, but his mind, still filled with confusion and fear, insisted that something was deeply wrong. The car was stopped at the same point where the race had started, and the street, previously dark and alien, now seemed different, completely familiar. The streetlights, the working traffic lights, and even the cars passing by him seemed real, but Rodrigo couldn't shake the feeling that he had been transported to a distorted version of reality. Trying to convince himself that it was all just a nightmare, Rodrigo put the key in the ignition and started driving, but the car felt heavier, slower, and his eyes were fixed on the rear-view mirror, where he hoped to see nothing else. There was no one behind him, but he didn't feel alone. Something was watching him, something he couldn't see but felt with an almost palpable intensity. With each kilometer covered, the weight on Rodrigo's chest increased. Traffic on Rio's streets seemed to continue normally, but he knew something had changed. The city, with its vibrant energy, now seemed to have lost some of its vitality, as if it was being suffocated by an invisible presence. It was then that he noticed something strange. As he made a turn towards the South Zone, he saw a familiar building, a luxury hotel near the beach. But when he looked again, the building seemed to fade away. In its place, a large empty plot of land, surrounded by broken walls, appeared abruptly, as if the city was reconfiguring itself before their eyes. Rodrigo felt dizzy, disoriented. He pulled the steering wheel hard, trying to keep the steering, but the blurred vision wouldn't go away. He passed through streets he already knew, but the feeling of displacement was overwhelming. That was when the car slowed down in an inexplicable way, and Rodrigo had to force his feet on the accelerator, trying to regain control. The streets around him began to distort, becoming narrower and endless. He tried to use the GPS, but the device didn't work. The map rotated indefinitely, as if the universe itself was playing with him. Suddenly, an intense light, similar to a lighthouse, illuminated the horizon. Rodrigo looked at the source of the light, his vision starting to adjust, but soon something frightening appeared in front of him. He saw, reflected in the rearview mirror, the woman. She was standing on the sidewalk in full street light, but it was no longer the woman he had transported. His image was now a distorted figure, a moving reflection of what appeared to be a supernatural being. His face was completely altered, his features distorted into an expression of immense suffering. Rodrigo tried to accelerate, but the car simply wouldn't respond. The woman was now approaching him. Her steps were heavy, as if the echo of each movement spread throughout the surrounding space. He saw the outlines of her figure blending with the shadows of the street, until suddenly the woman disappeared, as if she had merged with the night. What remained was a dense presence, an emotional vacuum that enveloped him. Rodrigo no longer knew if he was awake or if he was living in a nightmare. With his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, he noticed that the space around him was changing. The familiar streets had disappeared, and he no longer knew where he was. Everything was in a thick fog, as if he was being carried by something invisible and immense, a force that was guiding him towards a destiny he didn't understand. The feeling that he was trapped in an infinite cycle, with no control over his own life, took over Rodrigo. Each street seemed to be another repetition of the previous one, an endless prison. He didn't know whether he should keep driving or stop to try to understand what was happening. But when he looked once more in the rearview mirror, he saw something that made him swallow hard. The woman was back, but now she was no longer alone. There were other figures, indistinct shadows, surrounding the car. They began to approach, their empty eyes fixed directly on Rodrigo. He felt their presence as if they were inside his mind, and an unbearable feeling of dread came over him. It was as if he was being surrounded by an army of lost souls, trapped in a parallel dimension, waiting to be freed. Rodrigo, already panicking, tried to accelerate once again, but the car stopped completely. He was trapped, helpless. The figures, now around him, said nothing. His eyes, which were just black dots, conveyed a feeling of deep sadness and hopelessness. The city, Rio de Janeiro, which previously seemed full of life, now seemed like a ghostly, deserted, soulless city. Rodrigo was alone, and the sound of the dead engine seemed to echo for an eternity. Everything around him seemed to disappear, and he felt as if he was being pulled into an endless abyss. Rodrigo's panic enveloped him like a thick fog, making breathing difficult, his body tense, and his thoughts cloudy. He was completely immobilized, surrounded by these faceless, soulless shadows that were slowly approaching the car. His eyes, fixed on the rearview mirror, followed the figures with a mixture of fear and hopelessness. The engine was dead. The car was stopped in the middle of an empty street, with no signs of life around it. But despite his mind screaming for escape, Rodrigo realized something crucial. The shadows weren't touching him. They just watched him, as if they were waiting for something. Suddenly, a feeling of relief, albeit faint, began to emerge. The fear that dominated him began to slowly dissipate, as if an invisible force was showing him a way out. The image of the woman, previously so frightening, now seemed to have a less threatening, almost sad expression. The distorted physiognomy of the shadows also seemed to lose its aggressiveness. Rodrigo began to understand something fundamental. He was not being haunted by an imminent evil, but rather by a part of himself that he had ignored for a long time. The ghosts around him were not just spirits, they were reflections of their own insecurities, repressed fears and frustrations. He was faced with a manifestation of his inner shadows, a distorted reality that he had never wanted to escape until that moment. Each figure around him represented an aspect of his life that he didn't want to confront: the fear of failure, the bad choices, the unresolved guilt. The sight of the woman with her empty eyes no longer caused fear, but a feeling of regret. She represented all his losses and all the moments not lived. The car stopped, motionless, symbolized his own stagnation. Rodrigo had gotten so lost in the races of his life, running after something he didn't know what it was, that he forgot to live in the present. With his eyes closed, Rodrigo took a step back in his mind, breathing deeply. He didn't know if this was a dream or a supernatural experience, but he knew one thing: he needed to accept the darkness around him. He needed to face his own ghosts. When he opened his eyes, he felt a change within himself, as if he finally understood what he needed to do to move forward. As the figures around him slowly disappeared, the rain that had previously fallen incessantly stopped, and the streets of Rio de Janeiro, which had previously seemed like a maze, began to return to normal. Rodrigo was no longer surrounded by a ghostly city, but by the streets he knew, with the sky clear and the city at peace. The feeling of dread melted away, and he found himself for the first time in a long time in complete control of his life. The car, previously stopped and motionless, started working again with a slight noise, and Rodrigo felt that he had regained control. He was no longer a passive spectator of his own story. He had finally made the decision to face his fears. The woman's presence in the rearview mirror had dissipated, but something remained with him. The lesson that no matter how dark the road in front of him was, he could overcome it by facing his own shadows. The city around him seemed to breathe again. The lights from the streetlights, the cars passing by, and the soft sound of the city came back to life. Rodrigo no longer needed to chase something that made him feel alive. He knew now that to be truly free, he needed to let go of what imprisoned him: the guilt, the fears, and the doubts. When the last shadow disappeared and the car glided through the streets again, Rodrigo had a profound insight. He knew that the journey that began that night was not just a car race, but a path of self-discovery. He had explored not only the city of Rio de Janeiro, but also his own mind, and now he was ready to move on. The journey was still far from over, but he felt that whatever had happened on that dark path, with its shadows and mysterious figures, was now part of his past. And finally, he could drive toward a clearer, truer, more self-aware future. Rodrigo felt that the night was coming to an end. The weight that was previously suffocating him had lessened, but he still felt like something was about to happen. The car, now running smoothly, glided through the streets of Rio de Janeiro, and as it crossed the city, the early morning light began to brighten the horizon. But although the surrounding scenery seemed more peaceful and familiar, the feeling that something was coming never left him. He still didn't know exactly what he was about to face, but the truth was beginning to form in his mind. He needed to understand that that journey, full of mysteries and terror, had been a lesson in his life. While passing through a quieter neighborhood, Rodrigo noticed a small bar on the corner. It was a simple place, with dim lights and a flashing sign announcing that it was open. He didn't know why, but he felt an irresistible urge to stop. Perhaps it was the last part of his search for answers, or perhaps it was a reflection of the last opportunity to find some kind of clarification before the journey ended. The bar seemed out of time, almost untouched by the city's frenetic modernity. Rodrigo parked the car with a deep sigh. He didn't know if that was just another reflection of his fear, or if there was something there waiting for him. Upon entering the bar, the feeling of familiarity immediately enveloped you. The room was silent, with just a few people in the background, and soft music played in the background. He went to the counter where the bartender watched him with a thoughtful look, as if he knew something that Rodrigo didn't yet understand. The bartender, without saying a word, placed a glass of beer in front of him, and Rodrigo, in silence, took a sip. The bitter taste ran through his throat, but as he swallowed, he felt a lightness, as if something had dissolved inside him. The bar was calm, the music was soft in the background, and the environment, despite being simple, brought a feeling of peace that Rodrigo hadn't felt in a long time. But the peace did not last. The bar door opened with a bang, and a figure quickly entered. It was a woman with a fixed gaze and an imposing presence, which immediately made the room seem small and cramped. Rodrigo recognized her instantly. She was not the same woman he had seen on his journey the night before, but she was unmistakably similar. Her eyes, with a deep and enigmatic shine, were fixed on him, as if she had returned to conclude something, to give him what he had not yet understood. She approached him with unusual calm, and Rodrigo, speechless, watched her sit down next to him. He didn't know what she wanted, but he no longer felt the fear that her presence had previously caused him. She was there for something more, something he couldn't fully understand. The figure in front of him seemed to transcend the terror he had experienced. She was a metaphor for his own life, full of mysteries and unrevealed lessons. Without saying a word, she simply looked at him and then made a gentle gesture, as if indicating for him to look at the mirror on the wall behind the counter. Rodrigo, without knowing exactly why, turned around. In the reflection, he saw not just his own face, but a new version of himself. It wasn't the figure he knew. It wasn't the man tormented by the night. He was someone stronger, more secure, someone who had finally accepted his own demons, the shadows and fears that always haunted him. He saw the city in the background, but instead of a chaotic place, he now saw it from a different perspective, as if the same places he knew had turned into symbols of his own journey. The buildings, the paths, even the dark streets, everything seemed to have a connection to what he had faced. He understood, finally, that the shadows that had followed him were not just manifestations of fear, but reflections of his own resistance to change, to grow. Every difficult moment, every pain, every choice he had avoided or tried to escape was now part of him. When he looked at the woman again, he saw that she was smiling slightly, not in a threatening way, but with a smile of someone who knew that he had finally understood. She stood up slowly, as if her mission had been accomplished, and headed towards the bar door. Rodrigo felt that somehow that meant the end of his search, the end of terror and suffering. He had crossed his own abyss and was now ready to move forward without fear. When he got up to leave, the bar was already empty. The bartender, the soft music, everything was gone. The street was brighter, and Rio de Janeiro, with its unique energy, stretched out before him. What Rodrigo felt, however, was not a sense of loss, but of completion. He had finished the journey, not because the terror had ceased, but because he had been transformed. He had faced his own fears, and in the process, freed himself from them. Life now seemed much clearer. Upon returning to the car, Rodrigo no longer felt the pressure of the stranger. He was no longer haunted by shadowy figures or fear. He had found himself, and finally the weight of the night had been lifted from his shoulders. The car now ran effortlessly, and the streets of Rio de Janeiro, which had previously seemed threatening, stretched out in front of him, inviting him to move forward into a new chapter. The sound of the engine was the only music he needed to hear right now. Rodrigo knew that, from that moment on, the journey would no longer be about what pursued him, but about what he would choose to be. Rodrigo drove through the streets of Rio de Janeiro, now with a clarity he had never experienced before. The city, which previously seemed like a labyrinth of uncertainty and fear, was now an open map before him, with infinite possibilities. The sky was beginning to lighten, the city lights illuminating the path ahead, but there was something different in the air, a feeling of renewal, of a new beginning. He didn't know exactly what the future held for him, but now he was prepared, no longer looking for external answers or trying to escape the shadows that chased him, but rather looking for something within himself, peace and acceptance. The journey through the city had not just been physical. Every curve, every street walked, had represented a step in overcoming their own ghosts. The feeling of being trapped and with no way out, which haunted him, disappeared as Rodrigo faced what he feared. He knew now that true liberation came not from a distant place, but from within himself. He was no longer the man who allowed himself to be consumed by doubt or fear of what he could not control. Rodrigo passed through the city center and observed Copacabana Beach in the distance. The sight of those waves gently breaking against the sand brought him a feeling of calm. He felt in tune with the calm rhythm of the ocean. The same sea that symbolized the unknown for him now seemed like an ally. Like the sea, his mind quieted, and he felt a silent acceptance that life was unpredictable, but that he was now ready to face it. As the city lit up with the first rays of sunlight, Rodrigo knew that the past could not be erased, but he also no longer needed to carry it like a burden. He had made peace with his own choices, his mistakes, and the parts of himself that he had previously refused to face. The terror of that night, the shadowy figures and fears that took over his mind, had been a manifestation of his own internal struggle, a reflection of the difficulty he had in dealing with what he did not understand. Rodrigo now no longer felt weak. The feeling of having overcome something immense, something that had challenged him to look inside himself, brought him a strength he didn't know he had. He was finally ready to start over. There were no more races to run, no more destinations to reach. The real journey was what he was doing now with his own being, and the path ahead, although uncertain, was clearer than ever. The car stopped at a traffic light. Rodrigo looked around, seeing people coming and going, the city lights reflecting in their faces, and knew that although life took its course, he was now more aware of what he wanted. He didn't need any more answers. Everything he needed was already inside him. At that moment, something inside Rodrigo completely calmed down. He no longer feared the unknown. He no longer felt lost in the shadows. He knew that although the streets of life could be complicated and often unforeseen, he had control over how he would navigate them. Rodrigo smiled to himself, a silent smile but full of satisfaction. He didn't know what the future held for him, but he knew he was ready to face it head-on with courage and understanding. He had freed himself from the invisible chains that bound him and was now free to walk his own path. As the car moved forward, he looked at the horizon. The sun was already starting to rise, and Rio de Janeiro, with its vibrant colors and unique energy, was waiting for it. For Rodrigo, the day was not only the beginning of a new journey, but also the symbol of an internal victory. He had overcome his own shadows,